Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. My name is Carey, Nieuwhof, and I'm here with Barna's Savannah, Kimberlin, and we are here to equip you as church leaders through the craziest year we have ever lived through. You know, Savannah, David Kinnaman, and I, we started this podcast last March when the world shut down, and we kind of thought it was a temporary assignment, and here we are already into 2021, and the world just keeps getting more chaotic, more unpredictable, and more conflicted. And here we are trying to lead in the middle of it, right?
Who would have thought? I mean, if you would have told any of us in March that this is where we'd be, I don't think any of us would have believed you. So,
Oh my goodness. And everybody, you know, and we'll be tracking this too when we talk to leaders, but I think most people were thinking, well, the fall will be normal. Okay. The fall
right.
will be sane. And then it's like, well, at least there's 2021. Okay. So at least there's 2021. And then, you know, we have the assault on the Capitol, and it's like, oh, it's insane. So if you're exhausted, I get it. We keep these episodes on the short side. And what we try to do is we try to bring you helpful voices, real-time data, and we're just trying to hang in there together and give you the tools that you need to get through as you lead your local church. So this episode and next episode, we've got Sam Collier as a guest, which I'm very excited about. He is a church planter. He's planting Hillsong Atlanta. He's also a speaker, an author, has a national platform of his own, but he teamed up with Hillsong to launch Hillsong Atlanta. So we talk about church planting in the pandemic. That's during this episode. And then we're also going to talk about the turmoil, personal boundaries for him, and in light of everything that's going on, and then also racial justice and the turmoil we're seeing in our nation. He wrote a really, kind of a post for the Hillsong blog that went viral, got national coverage on sort of the approach to the assault on Capitol Hill. So we're going to talk about that. But Savannah, ground us in some data. What are we learning about church planting in a pandemic?
Yeah, happy to share some data with us today. It was interesting when this topic came up as something that we wanted to talk about on Church Pulse Weekly, because it's so important and an amazing topic to discuss, but we don't have any data from church planners in the pandemic because there are so few of them.
Yes.
So
we do have one episode on that, and so if you go back on the archive, you can see that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of plans got put on hold, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think to round out the story today, we're going to share some church planting data from the past, and then maybe take some time to reflect on what does it mean this year, right? So our first data point is about finances with church plants, because I mean, I wonder, and I am sure that finances with church plants have been disrupted this year. So we gathered data in 2016 from a lot of church planners, actually hundreds of them. And we wanted to ask those church planners, how do they feel like their financial situation is? Are they confident what's going on? And in 2016, 68% of church planners said that their finances felt stable or even more secure than that. So that's almost 7 in 10 church planners felt stable. And I really wonder, is that disrupted? Are church planters today feeling financially stable? Maybe there's disruption with finances in church planning because of the pandemic.
Well, and one thing we do know you're right, we haven't been specifically tracking planting separately from most churches, but we saw a pattern emerge in 2020 that we're going to continue to track in 2021. That was, and I'm generalizing here. Remember, I'm not the statistician, okay? But about 20% of churches saw increased givings. The majority of churches saw it somewhat stabilized, and
That's right.
a lot of churches were saved because they didn't have the normal operating expenses. So even if givings were, let's say, 10% down, if expenses were 20% down because of rent and physical meeting costs, and honestly, things as simple as coffee and supplies, that still created a bit of margin. And then there was a percentage of churches that were definitely down. And, you know, this year, the longer this crisis goes, the more we'll see that market consolidation among growing churches, the sort of struggling plateau. And I think churches that were having a hard time might have a harder time moving forward. Those were the general trends that we were tracking month to month. To date. But again, that doesn't separate out church planting data. And even Sam says, we pre-recorded the interview with Sam, you know, Sam said, hey, you got to work at it, man. Like money, like it's there. People want to give. but it just seems a little bit harder right now.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. So we hope to gather data on that in the future. How is church planting really disrupted financially? So it's a fascinating thing to think about.
All right. And anything else you want to share before we jump in with Sam, Savannah?
Sure, happy to. One more data point for us today. So in the middle of July of 2020, we wanted to ask a question about the emotional state of the congregation. So we asked pastors, how are your people doing? And it was interesting to see the results. And I would like to maybe suggest, let's apply this to the church planner audience, and I'll talk us through that in a second. But of course, the number one response was hopeful. Right. So we saw that's how pastors think their congregants were feeling in July. They were hopeful. But the next three answers on the list were tired, anxious, and frustrated. That's how people felt, which we know that pastors this summer had to step in to lead their congregation through a really hard season. And they're continuing to lead their congregation through a really hard season. So I wonder what the experience of the church planter is like right now, considering that before 2020, perhaps they didn't have as many opportunities to build rapport with their congregants, to lead them through those emotions that they were feeling, like being tired and anxious and frustrated. How do you lead as a church planter and build rapport and build trust with congregants when emotions are stirred and when people are really struggling with anxiety and loneliness and the rest?
Well, and with the virus getting even worse now in most jurisdictions than it was at any point in 2020, I know that's the case where I am north of Toronto, and certainly in California in places, it's just surging to unprecedented levels. I would just iterate one of the best practices I think we've seen in polling church leaders on ChurchPulse Weekly, the leaders we interview, is that close connection. So a lot of churches immediately went to their phones and like old school called people. And I don't know about you, like we did some year-end giving just as a family and also as a company, but the people that really took the time to like call us, to Zoom with us, as much as I don't need another Zoom call either. But when there's that personal connection, I wonder if that's a really good practice, even going into 2021. In some cases, like in our case, we're going up on a year of not meeting in person. People haven't seen people. If you're in California, that's a very similar vibe. Like we just have not met in person. And even if your church is open, data would say 50 to 70% probably haven't showed up on a regular basis. So all these people are feeling disconnected. And I wonder if relationships win at the end of the day. Like if you want to really, and this will end this year, I'm going to predict that. You can tell me I'm wrong. But at some point we'll all be vaccinated, or the virus will stop surging and life will move into some element of normalcy. But I wonder if the relationships that are deepest will characterize the churches that are the strongest. So that's what I'm
interesting. You know what, Carey? It's also interesting to think that maybe when we look at it from that angle, that church planners actually have an advantage here, because they are investing in building relationship really aggressively, thinking about launch, thinking about building a core team. I mean, from the church planners that I personally know, it is all about relationships. So
100%.
maybe they will come out stronger, because in the midst of this pandemic, when their people are feeling chaotic and anxious, they are prioritizing relationship.
No, that's a really good insight, Savannah. And I think that's true, because if you look at someone like Sam, he started this a few months ago. So literally everybody that is on board has had a personal touch in the last few months. And so I would think most of the church planters listening, you're 18 months old, maybe at the oldest. And that kind of personal touch, whether that's a team of 20 or 200, or even in a Hillsong, 2000, as long as there's forward motion. He's going to talk about when he's going to plant in the pandemic. He's got like a plan A, a plan B. But that idea, because I think one of the challenges that we will monitor on the podcast this year is, okay, when we do fully reopen, what about all those volunteers? Like if you used to have 100 volunteers and you haven't talked to 70 of them in the last year, or if you had 1,000 and you haven't talked to 500 of them, like, are they all coming back? Are they all serving the way they used to? Like these are some things that I think we can now turn our mind to, rather than just, when am I going to be able to preach in person? It's like, how do I rebuild the connections, the infrastructure, the relationship, so that we're ready to go in person and online in the future? So
that's a great insight.
Super helpful. So I'll tell you what, we will do this again next week and look at some more data points. In the meantime, my conversation with Sam Collier. Sam Collier, welcome to Church Pulse Weekly.
Wow, I feel like I made it, man.
You made it. Hey, I don't even know how to introduce you these days because we've known each other for years now.
Yeah.
But you're like an author, a podcaster, a broadcaster, now a church planter, a communicator extraordinaire, host. I mean, the adjectives just keep flowing, dude.
Well, it's because you keep having me on different shows that you're on, so it just keeps taking me higher.
There you go.
It's your fault. It's your fault I keep adding all these titles.
Somehow I don't think that's 100% true, but it's always good to be with you in any forum, under any hat you happen to be wearing.
Nice.
But here's what you're doing, dude. You're planting a church in a pandemic. Like,
Yes.
This is incredible. So
Yes.
you announced recently that you and your wife, Tony, that's the thing we have in common, wives with great names, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. But you and Tony are planting Hillsong Atlanta.
That's
So
right.
love to know the origin story behind that. How did that happen? What was the thinking behind that? And then we got to talk about
Man. You know, the last time you and I spoke, we kind of had a little bit of the behind the scenes moment because
you were in LA.
I was in LA. Literally, I think when we were making the decision to jump into the Hillsong world, formerly in the North Point world, which everything is great between those. We can talk about that relationship later.
Sure.
Andy is blessed in, and we're excited, and we tried to do that first, and we ended up here, which is amazing. But you know, you've got the podcast public world, and then you've got the world that happens behind the platform, and me and you flow in that world a lot, you know, in terms of driving from Austin to Dallas and hotel
where we first met.
Right? That's where we first met. Hotel conversations in the lobby. That's why I feel comfortable wearing my hat.
100%, man. And you look good in a hat. Not me, but you do.
You could rock a hat. But man, I think, you know, a little bit about how that came about was, and I'll just be as candid and honest as possible.
Yeah.
Andy Stanley and Sandra Stanley in North Point Ministries changed my life and my wife's life. And before that, we were in different African-American led ministries that helped to establish our kind of Christian platform. But really, we really weren't put on the mainstream stage, if you will, of Christianity until we stepped on that North Point stage. I always say it's like getting a Harvard degree, which you know so well about, Carey. I mean, it is so much
I don't have a degree from Harvard, but yeah. I know what you mean, though. That's a lot of pressure and a lot of exposure at the same time. Particularly, and how old were you when you stepped out on that North Point stage for the first time?
Man, maybe 24.
I know. Like that was only a few years ago, right, dude?
Yeah, maybe 24. Yeah. I'm 32 now, and it was wild. And I'll be honest, and we don't have to stay on this too long, but I was kind of the first of my kind at North Point on a stage that came from a heavy Pentecostal, all Black environment.
Right. Bit of a culture intersection there, maybe a little bit.
Right. Just a little bit. And as you know, I've got a lot of energy on top of that. Like in the Black community, I have a lot of energy. So it's like they're telling me, calm down. And so that mixed in with me coming from this Pentecostal place, being 24, it was and me and you have talked about this, a 4 to 5 year journey of push and pull and learning and understanding and theological reformation, right? It's just like this crazy journey that I went down that would go on for about 8 to 9 years. And within those 8 to 9 years of organizations like Orange and Catalyst and North Point and Chick-fil-A and even Passion, and have some friends over there. Haven't worked with Passion per se, but organizations like that started embracing me and helping me and giving me a platform, turned into a podcast, television, all these other things. And I looked up one day, and that spirit-filled Pentecostal foundation that had been put in me from birth started creeping back up. and I found myself with a little bit of a conflict and a problem. And the problem was, and I said this to Lane Jones, who runs North Point Partners.
Yeah, mutual friend. Yeah.
Right. When we were talking just about the future, I said, I think my problem, Lane, is that I've just tasted too many things and I can't untaste them. That's my problem. I've grown up in this Pentecostal environment. I've had moments with gifts of the Spirit, experiential time on a Sunday. I've understood the power of intentionality around theology and systems and prioritizing the outsider, which is what North Point taught me so well, and leading yourself. I said, my problem is I've seen everything and I've tasted too many things and I can't get them out of my head. And so now I'm having to do this journey of kind of reconciling all of these different things that are happening on the inside of me, and how it makes sense and where it will make sense and how I become all of who I am within a system or outside of a system. And it just led us to this kind of church planning thing that we looked around everywhere in the city of Atlanta and we said, where is a place that embodies all of those things in a very balanced way? And in Atlanta, especially the South, usually the churches they lean one way or they lean the other way. Right. Either they're predominantly kind of all white and with a traditional Baptist foundation, or they're predominantly white with some sort of a charismatic foundation, or they're all Black with a charismatic foundation and Baptist foundation. But there's really nothing in between. There may be a few smaller churches, and shout out to the smaller churches, but there's really not. I mean, it's the South, right? It's the history of slavery, and let's just go ahead and go there, right? I mean, yeah. We ended up there on purpose, right? And so now we are working to kind of bring it together. And there are churches like North Point and Passion and so on and so forth that are doing great work on bridging the gap and trying to get there. We know Louis went through some different things, and so he's trying to figure it out right now. And the Passion team, and that was hard. And that was, I was praying for them, and Bernice King was praying for them, and all of that. But I spent a lot of time with Andy during that season. I know he's reading books about racism and all. So the South is trying to get it together. But when you look around, and when we looked around, there was really no place that embodied all of those things. And so I started to have the conversation with North Point about that, because they had invested so much in us. I'm a strong believer in growing from where you're planted. I'll say it this way, and I'll just be vulnerable with you and emotional with you, and y'all can cut out whatever you want to cut out. We because they had invested so much in us, we didn't want to leave them. We just didn't. We love them. If you go on my Instagram, I got videos about how much they did for us. And I'm such a loyal creature. I want to pay the people back, in a sense, that invest in me. And so we started on a 2-year journey of talking with Andy, and me and him were going back and forth, and he was asking me questions and I was asking him questions. And it really just kind of got to the point to where we both were kind of saying, okay, can you been in this area? And he was saying, okay, well, can you been in this area? And we both were just like, hey, we love each other, but we each have specific visions that we're trying to get accomplished, and they may not be able to mix together, but we at least can celebrate each other in it. And so honestly, Andy had to say no to me a lot of times for me to say, okay, if you're sure, right? And he kind of had to give me his blessing. And once that happened, I stepped out and started having conversations with good friends like Brad Lomenick about the Hillsong world, and even the Bishop Jake's world, kind of the Potter's House world, about, what would be a good place for us. And when we stepped into Hillsong LA for the first time, we knew it was where we were supposed to be.
Oh, that's a great story. And you know what? This is where I wish everybody listening to the show had all the back conversations and some of the back episodes that you and I recorded on my other podcast there, because they could understand how rich and how mutually rewarding the relationship with you and Andy. That's one of my favorite stories, to see everything he was trying to figure out, connecting with you. You were learning under his leadership. And that's great. And Andy is so good at that. Just, when Louis started Passion, he blessed that. And, you're heading out. And that, I'll just be honest, having led in the senior leaders chair for 2 decades, I mean, part of you is really happy and part of you is like, oh, another church, like what's going to happen? Like, I'm not speaking for Andy, I'm speaking for me. Right. And, and for him to be able to do that is just so gracious.
Well, one of the things I'll say, and then I'm definitely going to, when we sat with Pastor Brian and Bobby, and we told them that we were going to come on board, Brian said, so is Andy okay? You know what I'm saying?
Is he cool with that?
Cool with this? I said, yeah. I said, he's talked about, he supported us. I've told him he's excited. He even said he would try to support financially. He was like, what? Who is this man? Right? It was just so that, and I'm going to do everything I can. Andy is even, and I'll say it publicly because he said yes. When we do open, at some point, he's going to come and preach for us on a Sunday. And so I just think the city of Atlanta needs that. And I want to model and expose the type of leader that he is, that celebrates and pushes out and desires unity so much that anyway, so.
Well, it's a very divided era. And I know this isn't specific to some of the tensions America and the world is going through right now, but what a great model. Like if you can't be united behind the scenes, how are you ever going to be united publicly? And to know that the private story is actually better than most people would think is actually a really cool conversation to have. And, I know Andy, I know you well enough to know that that's absolutely true, not just something you're saying. And I think that's a really good lesson to all of us because, as we talked about many times on this podcast, Sam, everything's changing. David Kinnaman has said numerous times on the show that from the data that he's seeing, he's thinking 20% of churches may not make it. And it's very easy to get into a scarcity mentality in that kind of environment, and to have an abundance mentality and to go from a place of blessing and there's enough. That is a really good note to every single pastor in every town, every community, every city around the world. What a great place to start. Sam, a couple of years ago, I wrote a series of posts and did some interviews on something I want to double click on with you about charismatic church. So like you say, right, there's sort of the charismatic world, which you're part of, and Hillsong's a particular flavor of charismatic. But my argument at the time, and I think it would still be true, is that I was noticing that attractional church had kind of peaked. And I've led and founded an attractional church, but that whole idea, and that charismatic churches tended to be churches that were on the whole growing, or churches that had a charismatic expression. Yeah. Can you offer any comment on that, or why you kept going back to those roots? What is it about the charismatic expression that's connecting with you and maybe with another generation?
Wow, Carey. First of all, love the question. Me and you have spent many hours talking about this. I would say, before I jump into the charismatic space, I would say that I needed the opposite in order to operate in the charismatic appropriately. Let me first of all say that. So
let's explain that a little bit, what that means. Yeah.
So I won't name any church in particular. I'll say I was in several, right? Yeah. Several, maybe like, let's go 5 to 6. So this doesn't embody, not all of them embodied what I'm getting ready to say. Mm-hmm. But before I came to North Point, my experience with the charismatic left me with a couple things that were awesome and that were not so awesome. And the first thing was I knew that God was real, 100%, right? The story I always tell is when Bishop Long, who had a massive church in Atlanta, New Birth, 25,000 member African-American church, when he laid hands on me for ministry. That's why I first got licensed in ministry. After I left there, I got licensed again and some other things. But there was a ceremony in which 20 leaders were gathered, and he was walking down the line, laying hands on people, and every leader was falling out. And as he's coming down, I said to myself, I'm not falling out.
Yeah, that would be me. It's like, no,
right, it's not happening. And I'm not going to fake it. Right. I was, I'm a millennial. So we're kind of rebellious in nature. It was kind of like skeptical, like, I'm not faking the funk. I'm not going to be pushed over either, right? If he pushes me back, I'm just going to stumble on my feet, right? It's just what's going to happen. And he was coming fast, Carey. So it was like boom, 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 like leader. And so he's kind of lightly touching you, lightly. And so he lightly touched me, and all I remember is waking up. That's all I remember. I was like because this was a moment. Right. This was a moment I was screaming in my mind that I was not going to fake this. It wasn't like the full church was there. Maybe 100 people were there kind of witnessing this process of licensing in ministry. So it wasn't like he needed a show. It wasn't like he was going to be embarrassed. I made up in my mind, I'm not going to fall. And I just think it was kind of just God's humor. Yeah, you will. Right. And so I woke up. So that's the first thing that I learned from the charismatic space, that God is real. He's alive. And he doesn't always do the things we want him to do, right? He's not a genie. He's not, right. We all know people we prayed for with healing and they didn't get healed, right? He doesn't do that. Miracles, but he can, is my point. He can do it, and he's alive. So that's the first thing I learned. The second thing I learned was that in those type of environments, there's something that can happen spiritually that can heal you, whether it's your mind. There's a sense of, I don't know if you ever listened, and I'm not endorsing theologically Bishop T.D. Jakes. I'm not endorsing, but I'm not endorsing. But I am saying, if you've ever heard Bishop T.D. Jakes speak, there's a gear that he can get in, and you feel like your insides are about to explode. He's like yelling. He's like, and you're like, I mean, it's just this moment. It's very similar to when you're at a concert and a mainstream, concert, and the rock singer is screaming and you feel like something in you changed, right? Like something touched you, the passion of ministry, and what God can do through passionate speakers and through people that are in passion, with a righteous indignation. He can change the world, right? Martin Luther King Jr. was, for all intents and purposes, a charismatic styled speaker. So, completely. And he changed the world. Yeah. So those are some of the things that I got. What I did not get, let me say it this way. The other thing that I got that did not serve me well was an incomplete theology. It was an incomplete theology. In other words, I knew how to pray for people. I didn't know how to take care of myself. I knew how to inspire people and speak to them in their lowest moments, and with my words, reach into their situation and pull them out of a suicidal moment. I knew how to do that, but I did not know what to do in suffering.
How did you not know how to take care of yourself?
Carey Nieuwhof, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm not going to let you off the hook with that one.
Yeah. Here's a good way. Here's a good one. I would come in church. There were many services I went to, not at Newburgh, and at many charismatic ministries. Yeah. And the pastor would say, whatever seed you sow, God's gonna, tenfold. You're gonna get back tenfold. And so I really believe, I had gotten to a point to where I really believed. And so the minister was like, sow a seed, a sacrificial seed. And I definitely believe in sacrificial seeds. Don't get me wrong. But it was from the perspective of, it was like investing in the stock market, right? If you give this, God's gonna 100 times.
I'm gonna buy Tesla low. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Got it. It's happening. It's gonna happen. And so I remember being 20, maybe 19, and all I had in the bank was $300, which at the time was still low. For me, it was higher than what it is now, but it was low, and I needed more money. And I took what the pastor said at the time. I went in the bank, got all $300 out, and put it in the offering.
Wow.
So I'm broke.
Now you're more broke.
Now I'm more broke. And so, but in my mind, Carey, and this is why I always say, how you view God determines what your life becomes. I view God as the stock market that was always in my favor. And I never got that money back. Never, first of all, I didn't even break even, right? I mean, it's like, so that's one example of many examples of how an incorrect understanding of the gospel and of the word leads to an incomplete life.
Yeah.
And that's what I didn't have. And that's why when I went over to a North Point, which was the complete opposite, it filled in all of the gaps that I was missing.
So now you're bringing this fused understanding into your leadership over at Hillsong.
100%.
I want to get into, because you got a lot of church planters listening to this and people who have planted. We've had a few of them on already in the pandemic. What's different about, well, first of all, it's your first church plant. Fair? Yeah. Is that true?
First. Yeah.
Yeah.
At the helm.
What's different about planting in a pandemic?
Oh my gosh. It's me and you, Carey. I'm just being honest. You can't make a decision about anything. I mean,
and it's hyper inflamed, right? Like everything is hyper inflamed right now.
Oh, it's hyper inflamed. As soon as you think Carey, you could spend a week, if not 2 weeks, on one decision. And then, a week on one decision. And then after those 2 weeks, have to change it. And now you're doing another. Literally, we just did a 6-month plan last week. And at the end of the meeting, we said, if nothing changes, we'll do this.
Yeah.
Right. But I can't even right now I'm going, well, we need to wait until after Biden gets inaugurated to actually say and to make any announcements about, and then we have to wait almost a week after to see what he does to the country based on the pandemic.
Right. Like, are you going to be able to meet? What about the mask mandate? What about vaccines? All that stuff. It is so provisional, all of your decision making. Let me just ask you a theoretical, and you may not know the answer to this question. Would you launch virtually, or do you think that you need to be able to meet in person to be able to have an effective launch? Have you guys made that decision?
Yeah, I think for me, and I might change my mind 2 months from now. So, but in this moment, I would like to say that if I can launch physically, I've been listening to you a lot on this, and so I believe it's both and, right? I agree. I don't think it's either.
Everyone thinks I'm the digital only guy. I'm like, I'm not. No, it's both and.
Not said that.
Guys, don't forget the internet. It's it's effective.
No, you've never said that you would just internet. You've never said that.
I've never said that.
But it's like tweeting. It's like tweeting today, right? It's like, I didn't say that. This is what
he says I said.
So, but I'm agreeing.
I didn't say that.
But I'm agreeing with you from the perspective of, I don't think we're going back to the day of only physical. I just don't think that's happening.
And Hillsong was one of the last that said we're not going digital, in part. I mean, you get a podcast, you can get some streaming events, but it was like, no, you got to be in the room. And obviously that's changed in the last year.
Right. And so, I will say, I think Pastor Brian is right there as well in terms of the both and. We just had a meeting with kind of all the global leads, and it's, listen, we're going to do everything we can to get back into the building safely, but we're also going to do everything we can to pursue what's happening online, because I think, it's the future. So I think for me, I have a plan to hopefully launch in person and online.
Yes.
But I do have a threshold to where if we can't meet by this date, then we'll launch online. But it's a long threshold. It's like right now, I think we're having this interview, the top of 2021. Like if I get to the latter part of 2021 and I'm still in the house, we're going to be doing some online. It's going to be, we're going to launch online. So
how has recruitment been online? Virtual. I take it you can meet with masks and that kind of thing, but everyone's got a different comfort level. Has that been more complicated, easier because of the pandemic, or what are you finding in recruiting? Like, you need a team of people, right? So you're doing that and you're raising money. So how is that going in the situation we're in right now?
Here's what I'm finding. And I'm going to split this up into recruiting members and launch team versus recruiting staff and then raising money, which kind of is together, but separate. In terms of the member piece, one of the things that we found is that, and this is something that me and Jet Wilhite talked about in Vegas when I was with him recently, because he's doing both. He's kind of doing both, and
Right.
you know, he's in a blue state or a blue city at least, and so it's a little bit more difficult for him to like me versus not. And then it's kind of like the governor and the president at one time were like beef. I mean, it was just like this thing. But one of the things I found is that people will give as long as you're doing something to help them. And when I say help them, I mean minister to them, care for them, whether that's online or in person, or like you have to be doing something. So for us, one of the things that we noticed very quickly is that when we would have a Zoom meeting or a prayer call or whatever, people would give more than if we were just sending emails saying, hey, help us build a launch capital.
Oh, so you found that face-to-face, voice-to-voice connection was more effective than just an email campaign.
Yes, people had to feel as if the ministry was actually doing ministry. And to your point about online, ministry doesn't just take place in person. It can be on a Zoom, it can be on a phone, even if it's a text devotional, there has to be some form of ministry, in my opinion, of what we're seeing, for people to feel like, oh yeah, I want to go ahead and give to this. I want to invest in this. If we weren't doing that, then when we don't do that, we find that giving is very low. It's very difficult to raise capital for something that is not really moving. So on that side, so now we're just, as you can imagine, we're doing as much ministry as we can in as many ways as we can from week to week, as we kind of build towards hopefully at some point doing a worship night or something socially distanced out in a park, something. We got to figure something out. Even if it's 2 people that show up, and then the rest are online, we feel like we need to get the ball rolling. In terms of staff and all of that, you know, what I'm finding is that it's so, I don't want to use the word easy, Carey, but I will use the word, it's not difficult.
Okay.
It's not difficult to get people on your leadership team during this season. And one of the things I found, it's a couple of reasons. I mean, one is Hillsong. So people love it.
You have the brand, right?
People
so
love it.
Oh yeah, I get that. The movement. Yeah.
100%. Me and Tony have some sort of brands. And so people kind of, they attach to that. But the biggest thing that I found is, people don't have anything to do right now. I mean, me and you were talking offline. They've not allowed you to travel. I mean,
I know. It's like, well, people ask me, are you free Monday night? Like I am every Monday night. Yes.
It's like, yeah, I'm free. Like people are doing things. You're able to get people to do things that you would never be able to get them to do before COVID, because people are just at home. They're figuring out. So I think just the idea of, hey, let's meet at a coffee shop, wear your mask, let's get the temperature checks. Like if you don't want to come, don't come. But just getting together with a small group of people and giving people something to do has been paramount for us. And so people, I'll just say my inbox is just flooded with so many people from around the country that are going, hey, if you're looking for staff, hey, if you're looking for this, I'll come and volunteer. Me and my wife are thinking about moving. And there's just this thing of people going, I want to be a part of something that I've not been able to be a part of because I need to do something. On top of that, I think, and maybe we'll get to this in a second, the conditions of the country, and what we have decided to lean into in terms of certain emphasis in our church, which is multiculturalism and speaking into the issues of the day and not being quiet about unity, not being quiet about denouncing the things that are plaguing our society in an intelligent way, obviously, and in an empathetic way, doing what we can to bring all cultures together. That is something that I am finding in the church from white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, that Christians are going, we need this more than ever. And we want to be a part of a church that is doing that.
I'm so encouraged to hear that. Before we leave, and we are going to go there, before we leave the whole planting thing, I mean, it was really interesting to me. And I don't want to name names, but you'll know who I mean when I tell you this. But I got introduced to an entrepreneur, was connecting with him, and he's like, "Wait a minute, you know the Colliers from Atlanta? Aren't they starting Hillsong?" I'm like, "Yes." I connected you guys via text.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Man, it's not that hard to raise money for this." Like he was like looking. It was like he was looking for something to give to.
Yeah.
What have you found? Because it's such a weird year economically since the pandemic, where some have been absolutely slammed and other people are like at all-time records. What have you discovered on the fundraising front as you try to establish Hillsong Atlanta? Easier than you expected, harder, wobbly? What are you discovering?
I would have to say it moderate. I would
Moderate,
say moderate. I think that obviously without a pandemic, it would be easier. You know, but it's not it's not what I thought it might be, which was a drought, you know, just because, and one of the things that we're noticing, especially in this fundraising kind of round in this season is, you know, depending on who you are and what you were set up for before the pandemic, you may have won like in a massive way, or you lost everything. So it's, you know, I always use the example of Zoom, right? I mean, people were dying left and right. Businesses were shutting down, and Zoom stock was through the roof.
Yep.
And there's so many organizations and leaders that were set up for online currency that they just won big. There are organizations, and like my brother, my stepbrother, I thought he was going to lose his job because he kind of worked in the service industry. But then when I discovered what he did, they actually gave him a raise because their company went through the roof, because what he does for a living is help stock grocery stores.
Yeah, he's got good employment. Yeah.
So he's rolling in it. He's like, I've never felt better, you know? And so, so what I'm finding is that, you know, there are people that really want to give right now. And then there are people that would love to give, but can't give anything. When we're talking to churches and nonprofits and organizations, it's kind of been the same conversation. I have to start every way with, hey, I'm not expecting anything. I know it's a tough time.
Well, that was part one of my conversation with Sam Collier. It is a fascinating conversation. We're going to bring you part two next week, where we dive in a little bit more to church planting, personal boundaries, and then also talk about the political and racial turmoil. And if you feel like you don't have the bandwidth to hear one more conversation about racial justice, I would encourage you to change your mind. Sam has a fascinating perspective on it that I think you'll find helpful and healing. And Sam's been somebody who has really spoken into my life personally and publicly over the last year. And if you're looking for a third way, you may want to pay attention to that because I think Sam does a great job of moving us past the hyperbole and the division and the tribalization. And if you're looking for hope in your congregation and a way of uniting diverse people, I think you'll find it in the next part of the episode. So we have a lot of information over at barnaaccess.com on church planting, on finances, on the mental and emotional health of people, and also pastors. A lot of that is available for free. Some of it, if you really want to go deep, is available if you join by membership, as I have and many others have. You can find that all at barnaaccess.com. Thanks so much for watching and listening to Church Pulse Weekly. If you've appreciated this episode, subscribe, leave us a rating and review. And here's some encouraging news. David Kinnaman's going to be joining us again in the future for an episode, probably in the next month or so. So continue to pray for him as he mourns the loss of his wife. But it will be wonderful to welcome David back to Church Pulse Weekly. Thanks so much for tuning in.